All right, welcome to week 3. We're going to cover some ground, and I'm going to make a little mini lecture here for everybody to view. And first topic we're going to cover is textual criticism. So maybe you're familiar with some of these categories where you hear the Masoretic text. You maybe have heard about the Qumran scrolls or the Samaritan Pentateuch. So what we're talking about here is after the close of the canon in 400 BC. This was after the completion of the inscripturation process that we talked about last Monday. We look at a study of the comparisons of the copied text. These are the copied texts by scribes. And we study these copies, or the hand copies, basically to piece together the original, or get as close to the original as we can. Remember, we don't have the original autographs, but we're trying to get back to as close to the original autographs as we have. Actually, what we have is better. What we have are artifacts of text from different areas and regions around the world. So what we can do is compare those, and this is the science of textual criticism. So textual criticism is a discussion of what we call witnesses and versions. Witnesses are the Hebrew copies of the Hebrew Bible, so that's Hebrew to Hebrew. Versions are the translations of Hebrew, or in some cases translations with a little extra interpretation thrown in. And these are translations of the original Hebrew text. So when we talk about witnesses, so these are going to continue to be in Hebrew, witnesses to the or the original text, we talk about 3. We talk about the Masoretic text. This goes back to about 500 to 1000 AD. We talk about these are the Masoretic scribes, and these are the scribes, as we learn, if you get into Hebrew and learning Hebrew later, you'll work with the MT, or what's called the Masoretic text. This is the text that has all of the vowel markings, accents, and all the corrective comments in the margins of the Masoretic text, all for the purpose of the preservation and the reading of the text. So from the Masoretic text, the oldest complete manuscript that we have is called the Leningrad Codex. The second of the witnesses is called the Samaritan Pentateuch, and these are the Samaritans from that period that goes all the way back to 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 14 through 21. They had their own version or copy of the Pentateuch, and that's the text that they read. Scholars think that the Samaritan Pentateuch preserves an early 4th century BC text of the Pentateuch. Finally, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are about 221 texts and fragments of text from the Old Testament books. Every book is covered with the text or fragments except for the book of Esther. And the Dead Sea Scrolls as a group are dated back to 250 to about 135 AD. The versions of the Old Testament, so these are the translations. So the first of the versions is the most popular and the most well-known is the Septuagint, or the LXX, which dates us back to about 250 to 100 BC. It involved about 72 scholars working to translate from the Hebrew into Greek in the Hebrew version that they had at that time. Translation techniques. Every one of the scholars that were working had their own translation techniques, and this is a whole study in and of itself. The second of the versions is called the Aramaic Targums. So when the Old Testament was orally read and translated, this was a practice that goes all the way back to Ezra from Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 8. So this oral translation and reading of the text was going on into Aramaic was going on during the time of the Assyrian Empire. So all the way up through to the Second Temple period, that's the time of the exiles who have come back, every book of the Hebrew Bible had its own Targum except for Daniel and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So these are targums that exhibit both a free but sometimes a literal translation of the text. Finally, we have the Latin Vulgate, and this is a Latin translation of the Old Testament that dates to about 250 AD. So here in this slide we have the versions listed with the witnesses, and the combination of the witnesses that date back to 250 BC, taken with all these are the versions or the translations. We have the science of textual criticism, and it's basically the science of comparing all of the above for the purposes of locating the original text as close as we can of the Old Testament. So this is a science of, you might say, cleaning up the text and correcting, making corrections to some of the scribal errors that may have come in during that time period of the transmission of the text after the close of the canon from 400 BC onward. So in reality, we're only talking about a small percentage of cleanup work and the kinds of errors that the scribes committed. These are manual errors, errors of sight and sound. You have letter confusion, Hebrew letters that have a similar shape, so in the copying you end up misspelling a word, what's called haplography. This is an error of omission, leaving out a letter or leaving out a whole word. And also didography, which is an error of addition, adding an extra letter or word. So the science of textual criticism is basically lining up the Masoretic text and comparing it to variant readings of the same text or verse or word from either the witnesses or the versions. Here's just a couple of examples. So the Masoretic text reads, "The Lord shall make heard, ... A variant coming from one of the Qumran scrolls, the book of Isaiah, "The Lord shall make heard, make heard." So that's an example of words written twice, which is didography in the variant. Now, going backwards here in the second example, "I will leave the corpses of the Philistine army." That's what the Masoretic text reads. But from the Septuagint, it says, "I will leave your corpse and the corpses of the Philistine army." So that's an example of haplography. Here a word was omitted from the MT, and it shows up in an older version, here the Septuagint, which dates back to 250 BC. And that's the corrected version right there. So here's a nice quote from Gleason Archer that basically sums this up. "Is this a problem? The text from Qumran proved to be word for word identical to our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of all of the text. The 5% of variation consisted primarily of obvious slips of the pen and in spelling alterations." So that's what we just talked about. So that's a pretty good track record. So just a few words on the reliability of the Old Testament as it relates to history.
Stupid videos.
So I think that's coming through okay. The self-hating dog. So the reliability. Is this going to be a problem? Kind of like what this dog is creating for himself. Alright, enough of that. So is the Bible giving us accurate details with regards to the people, places, and events that it reports about? You know, we don't have a cave with the writing on the wall that says Abraham was here. Or we don't have a city that was named after Moses. But we do have some interesting discoveries as they come forth from archaeology that shed light on early biblical history as it's presented in the Bible. So we don't have any reason to get frustrated like this dog. Just a few examples, just to kind of wet our whistle. This is one called the Ketef Hinnom Scrolls. It was just discovered in 1979, so not too long ago, in a burial chamber near the old city of Jerusalem, and it was an amulet scroll that would be worn around the neck of the owner, and it took 3 years to unwind because it was so compact, just so you know. But it contained the Aaron or the Aaronic priestly blessing of Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 through 25. "The Lord keep you and the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. Scholars date that to about the 7th century BC. So this is significant that this dates 400 years before the oldest witness, that is the Qumran text or the Dead Sea Scrolls. The implication is it points to a long-standing written tradition behind the text of the Old Testament. Here we have an even more recent discovery, Tel Dan inscription, dated and discovered in 1993. This was the portion or a portion of a monument and an inscription that basically states House of David, and in a line just below references the phrase King in Israel. This is a significant event because it references King David, and it's the only one that we have outside of the biblical context. Critical scholars have sometimes gotten a little too critical and doubting that King David ever even existed in biblical history. And this discovered in 2008 near where David defeated Goliath. Just some text written on a broken piece of pottery, but this is old Hebrew. It's not biblical text, but it represents one of the oldest examples of early written Hebrew, and it shows evidence of early scribal activity. So this was at a military outpost that was in existence in the 11th to maybe the 10th century BC. And this is what ancient Hebrew language would have looked like during the time of King David and King Solomon. So now we're going to move into a discussion of the history of Old Testament scholarship or study, the Old Testament and higher criticism. Criticism is not a word that means critical so much. It just means kind of a revved up study, or you might say a more scientific way of studying the Bible. After the age of the Enlightenment, everything was up for grabs because of the scientific method that was introduced. Everything was open for scientific analysis, including text, ancient text, and even the Bible. Scholars began jumping onto this bandwagon. So we have some of the precursors to the higher critical methods of studying the Bible. The first one was Baruch Spinoza. He was a Jewish philosopher. He converted to kind of a nominal Roman Catholicism. He began to investigate the Bible philosophically as opposed to theologically. He rejected the authority of the church, and thus he rejected the authority of the texts. He rejected divine inspiration and questioned the authorship of Moses, claiming that the Pentateuch was a collection and composition of Ezra the scribe in post-exilic times. The second scholar here, Jean Ostruc, he was French. He was an assistant, a physician to King Louis the 15th. He didn't set out to undermine the traditional understanding of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Ostruc claimed that Moses did write it, but with the use of sources. So Moses is using oral or written sources because he was not an eyewitness to the events recorded in earlier chapters in Genesis, the patriarchal history in Genesis 1 through 11. So Ostruc began the work of combining texts along certain criteria and aligning them as a means of trying to identify the sources behind the final text. For example, he was one of the first ones to recognize the interchanging names of God, Elohim and Yahweh, and maybe identifying those two potential sources. So he really launched the whole field of source critical analysis. So source criticism started taking on a life of its own. Scholars would begin to identify these sources a little more clearly and different hypotheses. The J source or the Yahweh source, the E source, the Elohist source. Then later a D source, which would be called the Deuteronomistic source. And dating these sources at various times in the history of salvation. Later an E source was added and broken out from a priestly source, a P source. Julius Wellhausen is deemed the father of the popular what's called the documentary hypothesis. That's the JEDP theory. You hear it referred to that. However, a scholar named Groff was really a precursor to Wellhausen. He was really the first to arrange the sources along the lines of what was called religious development. The basic argument was built off of evolutionary theory, which was also growing and rising at the same time, parallel to this conversation. Basically, the argument was you cannot start a religion with a highly developed, sophisticated monotheism, that is the belief in one God. That was the end of the process. They would argue because of evolutionary theory, the process really begins with a more primitive animism that moves to pantheism, which then moves to polytheism, which then moves to henotheism, the belief in one God, but then you talk about other gods as well. Finally, the end step is monotheism. So they would argue that this is the way Israel's faith life developed and was arranged over time. So the end product of the documentary hypothesis is kind of summarized in this chart. Various sources, J, E, D, and P, along the faith development of Israel over time, and then several different what's called redactions. The redactions would be basically the combining of the sources. A redaction 1, the combining of the J and E source. A redaction 2, the combination of the JE with the D source, and then finally a third redaction in and around the time of Ezra at that post-exilic period, bringing in the P source. And here is another way of looking at it. One Moses or Moses's. I don't know if I said that right. Moses's. Multiple Moses's, JEDP. But any hypothesis must stand on its foundation or its pillars. It's a hypothesis built on pillars, and for the documentary hypothesis to stand, the pillars must all remain intact. So what we need to do is isolate the pillars and evaluate each one just kind of lightly, just to give you a feel or a flavor of this, because the documentary hypothesis does have its flaws. So some of the pillars of the documentary hypothesis. Textual references to Moses, that is Moses being an author referring to himself. What's called anachronisms. Modern terms used in older texts. Differences in the divine name, Elohim and Yahweh. Differences in languages and style. Differences in how humanity and God are referred to. And finally, the duplication of narratives. We call those doublets. So just a few basic responses to each one of these criticisms. Number 1, textual references to Moses. The response is that the use of third person is not uncommon among early histories. We have examples of this. Caesar's Gallic Wars, for example. Oftentimes scholars will refer to Deuteronomy 34 and the death narrative. How can an author write about his own death? But we concede things like that because we don't have to give up our Mosaic authorship in allowing perhaps a scribe of Joshua as a fitting tribute to the author of the Pentateuch, adding that last chapter as a tribute to the author. Criticism number 2, anachronisms. These are modern terms being put in the mouth of older biblical authors. And you have some references here to, for example, the examples of references to the Philistines in texts, in patriarchal texts like Genesis 21, 32, and 26 in that chapter. But the response is ethnic names are not necessarily used with modern precision. Philistines was a mixture of all kinds of peoples who came from the sea, so perhaps all lumped together under a single heading. For example, Europe. The Europeans will refer to everybody in America as a Yankee. So everybody in America is called a Yankee, for example. Another archaism or anachronism is the references to the camel being a domesticated beast of burden in Genesis chapter 24, verses 10 through 14. The argument goes that camels weren't domesticated until about 1000 BC. The response is, recently, camels have recently shown up on cuneiform tablets that date to about 18th century BC, right smack dab in the middle of the time of the patriarchs. The third criticism, different names to God: Elohim, which critical scholars refer to the E source, Yahweh, the J source, and El Shaddai, the priestly source or the P source. However, scholars will argue against this, that those differences in the names of God refer to the same God, but with a different meaning or emphasis. So Elohim, the universal or cosmic God; Yahweh, the covenantal name for God, that I referred to that in last week's lecture; El Shaddai, the God who rules over the heavenly court. So there's theological emphasis behind the use and the variation of a single author referring to God by these various names. Criticism 3, differences in language and style. So, for example, the J source refers to Mount Sinai, where the E source refers to Mount Horeb, the same mountain, but a different term. Well, here's the response. Style depends on content. One person's capable of writing many different types of materials, and the variety in language and style may just be basically one author giving a little variation and a variety in his own personal writing. Criticism number 4, differences in conceptions of God and humankind. For example, Abraham's presented in one text as a liar, and in the next chapter he's referred to as the hero of faith. So how can one author be so inconsistent, right? Here's the response. The Bible is one of the most honest books in antiquity. We shouldn't be surprised that to read about a patriarch as an honest patriarch, one who's the hero of faith, but one who struggles for faith. And then one who's transformed through trial to end up, for example, Genesis 22 is an example of a great demonstration of faith. We're invited, the author, I would argue Moses, invites us to read the patriarchal accounts and as a means of seeing ourselves. We read them, warts and all. We can identify with that. Finally, criticism number 5, duplications of the narratives. These are called doublets. The biggest example is the Genesis 1, Genesis 2. If you read, both accounts are talking about the same creation event. So is this a duplication that is indicative of two different sources kind of combined together? Or, in response, can we just understand that Genesis 2 is not an identical repetition of Genesis 1, but an amplification of the implications of Genesis 1:26 and 27? That is the image of God in man. So it's an amplification now of creation day 6 as it moves forward. So a hypothesis is going to rise or fall on its pillars. Here's another kind of detailed analysis that offers another strong argument in favor of Moses being the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it's a study of covenant forms. And we've done this. There's a whole field of study of the treaty or covenant forms of the ancient world. And if we put these covenant forms together, we basically see that there's 2 basic kinds of forms that are very similar. One of the forms comes from the early, mid, and late 2nd millennium BC. The second form is different in its structure and what it looks like, and that comes from the 1st millennium BC. So this is from the 2000 BC onward, and this is 1000 BC onward in terms of time. What we do then is do an analysis of the covenant forms that come right out of the biblical text, and some examples that we have from the patriarchal period. Abraham and Abimelech, Genesis 21, Genesis 26, Genesis 31. So what do those forms look like when we do the analysis? Well, we see that they take on a certain shape. Witnesses section, oath section, stipulation section, and a list of curses. So we compare those patriarchal covenant forms with the first millennial forms, and you can see there, here's our column here, compared with the first millennial covenant forms, and we don't see a real significant comparison there. However, we do the comparison to the early second millennium BC forms, that is the oldest forms that we have in Eureka. We see a real good similarity there in terms of second millennium BC covenant forms. So we continue our study of covenant forms, and now we're looking at covenant forms that come from the time of Moses. So far so good. Moses would be example, the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20 and the structure of the book of Deuteronomy. And as we did before with the patriarchal forms, we see a certain shape taking structure with regards to how the covenant forms that come from the biblical text from the Pentateuch. So now we're talking about a so-called Moses author being responsible for producing this particular form. And if we compare what form emerges, we see a certain form take place, and here it is. And if we do the comparison to the first millennium BC forms, we don't see a good match. Critical scholars, those who hold to a JEDP theory, would want to see a real strong comparison of this covenant form used by the JEDP authors, who would be operating later in history, after during in that first millennial period. However, instead, what we see is a comparison of the covenant forms that come out of the Pentateuch that would be responsible would be the responsibility of a Moses operating line up with the late second millennial BC, during the time when Moses would have lived and been active as an author. And this fits Moses. And here's the direct comparison. And the only difference is that the witnesses section in the later Hittite treaties that we see there are not present in what comes out of the covenant forms during the time of Moses. And the obvious reason for that is the witness of the covenant is implied being one God, not witnesses being multiple gods. So Moses intentionally leaves that out completely, because it's assumed that there's just one witness to the covenant that God has made with his people. All right? So when you're reading commentaries on the shelf out of the library and you run up against a critical scholar who has totally bought into and has adopted the documentary hypothesis, you might find in reading that particular author that he gets really caught in this web of talking about different authors working at different times in history. The J source, the E source, the D source, and the P source. And it ends up looking somewhat like a fragmented hard drive, or an unfragmented, or I should say fragmented hard drive on your computer. You got to defrag this thing. It's really hard to really talk about the theological continuity that I think screams off the page when you're trying to identify and keep track of a J, D, E, D, P source. It's difficult to say anything theologically at this point. There's another problem with the documentary hypothesis that I want to bring out with the JEDP theory. So here's the approximate timeline of the different sources. You see J, E, D, the combination of J and E, and then the P source, the combination of J, E, and P, and then the final redaction here during the time of Ezra the priest. But parallel to the so-called documentary hypothesis, when you have active authors, not Moses, writing these sources, is you have other examples of biblical authors writing their material down, like the writing prophets. For example, the prophet Amos. And so let's look at some of what Amos says in Amos chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. I'll read it really quick here. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they sell the righteous for money and the needy for a pair of sandals, they who pant after the very dust of the earth on the head of the helpless, and turn aside the way of the humble. And a man and his father resort to the same girl in order to profane my holy name. And on garments, that's the key, garments taken as pledges, they stretch out beside every altar, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. So without getting into a full-blown discussion of garments taken as pledges, I will have to let you know that this is something that was not good. The garments taken as pledges is something is held in a pawn. You might think of the idea of a pawn shop. So I'm giving you this item until you pay me back what you owe. So this was a means of the prophet Amos is to accentuate and amplify the injustice that was going on in and around his day. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, did the prophet Amos manufacture from scratch this legal language for his, what we call, his covenant lawsuit against Israel? Or did the prophet Amos bring in this legal language from a document into common understanding, delivering it for an audience that should have known better? So the biblical reference to this text, document held in pledge, there's legal language that comes from the book of Exodus in chapter 22 and the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 24. So according to the documentary hypothesis, you have Exodus, or the E source, that portion of Exodus anyway, coming from E here, and then also D here. According to the documentary hypothesis, you're going to have a prophet Amos generating this legal language and creating it from scratch, and then influencing this author here with the same text, and this author here operating a little bit later in history on the same concept, this garment taken as pledge, as not being a good thing. But it seems a little ridiculous to think that, because Amos is addressing a real audience who should have known better. And that's the whole point of his covenant lawsuit. He's a lawyer standing before God and the people. He's calling to the witness stand, and he's charging based on common knowledge and common awareness. He's not creating his legal case against the people, the Israelites in the north, the northern nation. He's not creating this legal language. He's bringing it as evidence against them. So, my argument, it seems very, 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 really necessary that a document fully developed and already existence is in place. So there I throw in a slide. JEDP really means Moses. Moses, the author. We're talking about one author. So everything that Amos, the author, is bringing in for his covenant lawsuit against Israel, he's bringing in Pentateuchal curses, judgment. He's building the case for judgment and exile, but he's also bringing in the Pentateuchal blessings from places in the book of Deuteronomy, for example, and pointing ahead to this coming day, this restoration on the day of the Lord. He's not creating this. He's pulling from Moses. And if Amos and Moses were sitting around a Starbucks coffee shop, they'd be saying, amen, brother. Thanks, Amos and Moses. Moses would say, I see what you did there, Amos, and yeah, you got me right. And that kind of a conversation would be taking place. So we move on. Some scholars started to get a little bit tired of the documentary hypothesis and went on to other things. So other ways of scientifically studying the Old Testament. Hermann Gunkel was one who led the way with regards to form analysis. And he assumed that behind the literary, or that of the writing down of the Pentateuchal stories, was this pre-literary or oral stage. So the oral stage behind the written stage. He had done a lot of studying of, in his context, the Northern European folk tale idea. That was a way for the tribes at that time to preserve their history through the retelling of these folk stories. So he identified them, developed this special category of this type of genre, and applied it to the study of the biblical text. So you have these genres that emerge, and this is where the genre idea comes from. A genre in the biblical context would be something like a hymn, a lament, a short story, covenant documents, etiologies, stories that explains why things are the way they are, or a call narrative, or different things like that. So you identify the form, and then you take a step back or beyond that, and you start talking about fairy tales, folk stories, legends, histories, myths, sermons, hymns, and prayers, and things like that. Another thing that emerged from this form analysis was the idea of a Sitz im Leben, the setting in life, that is the context. So the development of recognition of the speaker, who's the audience, and what's the historical context. So the positives, some of these really produce some really good categories for study. We do need to study the structures, the genres, the historical and cultural backgrounds behind the text. This is all very helpful. But the thing that we need to balance here, and that this is the caution, sometimes it's we can't impose these forms onto a text. So sometimes it's a bit speculative at best to determine a Sitz im Leben for any biblical text. So that's where we get that's where this can get carried away. So a step beyond form criticism, the next development coming from Martin Noth. He advanced form criticism farther into what was called tradition criticism. A tradition analysis attempted to determine the great themes of the Bible and the historical traditions behind them. So it's a little more comprehensive, as you can see. So traditions being originally oral and then written. So Noth applied source and form analysis and argued for 5 basic themes that emerge in the Pentateuch: a promise to the ancestors, guidance out of Egypt, guidance in the wilderness, revelation at Sinai, and guidance to the land. So Noth had in this case, a low view of the historicity of the details of the text. And he would call a figure like Moses as a creation of later biblical authors and writers. So he was just a figment of everybody's imagination. One of the German scholars who I appreciate a lot is Gerhard von Rad. He was a German Lutheran pastor, and he responded, interestingly, in his day to the anti-Old Testament bias. He's in and around during World War II, and so there was this definite German bias against the Old Testament in the churches due to the fact that it told the history of the Jewish people. He got Old Testament scholarship as a means of bringing the Old Testament back into the churches. So with the help of Noth, he applied form criticism to the Pentateuch in response to the rigid source criticism of his day. And he sought to identify the traditions behind the oral history before the text was written. More recently, some scholars have attempted to move in a totally different direction, less concerned with more diachronic issues such as history, author, audience, sources, and context, to what we call a more synchronic concern or focus. That is the final form of the text, what the text says in its final form, without any great concern for other historical matters. So this is called literary analysis, literary criticism, and of all the approaches that we've looked at so far, can be the most helpful for one who's curious about understanding and interpreting what the text is saying. So we can really pull from Robert Alter, who's actually a scholar at Indiana University, and I think he's still alive. Literary criticism helps us to recognize that in biblical narrative, and we're not talking about poetry, authors can be selective, they can be responsible for arranging their materials. For example, the relationship between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The authors can be responsible for shaping the text. Why does the author create emphasis in the way that he says things and writes things down? So we have examples of selection. The genealogies represent a way of bringing together historiography. And the selectivity helps us to understand that genealogies were selected intentionally by the biblical authors, in this case Moses. Moses is selecting genealogies that bring emphasis to the patriarchal history. Genesis 5, Genesis 10, Genesis 11, Genesis 25, and chapter 36. Another example of selectivity is in the book of Judges. So there the author in chapter 3, verse 31, gives one single verse to the judge Shamgar. He's the one with the ox goad. But other judges in the book of Judges have full chapters, like, for example, Gideon, a full amplification of him and development of his character and his adventures and all of these things. So that's an example of selectivity. Was there more information available to Shamgar? Probably. But the author chooses not to focus on Shamgar at all and give any amplification other than that one heroic event that he did. Another example of the author and what the authors are allowed to do, according to literary criticism, is arrange and sequence their materials. So if you read the book of Judges, one great example is the intentionality of starting with kind of a mild case, but by the end of the book of Judges, you have this downward spiral out of control, which just brings greater amplification to the chaos during this 400-year period. So all to say, literary analysis really helps us to ask the good and right questions about the text. What is the author doing? Why does he say it the way that he does? But the weakness of literary analysis is that it really doesn't, it kind of totally ignores the historical context, the author and the real audience, the real author behind the message. So the who is talking to whom and when and for what reason, all of these things are necessary for the purpose of recreating as best we can. This is the challenge of interpretation. What is the author saying? What is his message? You know, can we talk about Jeremiah as a real prophet preaching on the streets of downtown Jerusalem as the Babylonians are threatening to destroy the city? Can we do that? I think so. So that's the kind of the weakness of this. So an evaluation of these modern critical approaches, sometimes they use circular reasoning, their assumptions are questionable, somewhat biased. Sometimes they get a little too myopic or intense scrutiny, you know. And the critical scholars that are out there, especially with regards to the Old Testament, will oftentimes marginalize conservative scholarship, those scholars who regard the authors, the history, the real people, places, things, and events seriously. Those scholars who take those things seriously are marginalized and put off on the sidelines with regards to biblical scholarship. And that seems a little bit unfair. And more specifically, with regards to Mosaic authorship, critical scholars generally ignore completely any of the internal evidence for the essential Mosaic authorship. They ignore, for example, examples of first-hand detail. Exodus 15:27. There is an author who would have had a first-hand account of the event, for example. Moses having full acquaintance with Egypt. Language archaisms. Use of the masculine third person. There's some other things there. My big thing is Moses' qualifications. His education from Egypt, his Hebrew background, his knowledge of the geography. He had time and he had the ability to write. So those are all internal evidences. And the external evidence that we have to Moses being responsible for the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, they're in Joshua chapter 1, verse 7, kind of an internal reference to the Mosaic Torah. a book that was completed and written down and handed off or handed over to Joshua and company. So when we take Mosaic authorship seriously, we have to be careful what it means and what it doesn't mean. Things like the dictation theory, God just gave Moses every word to write down. We have to take the human author seriously, a human author who has a real audience and has available to him things such as sources. So what it doesn't mean, what Mosaic authorship doesn't mean, is that he wrote it all himself. It doesn't mean that Moses wrote it and no one updated it at any other time later in Israel's history. And it doesn't mean that Moses had to have written his own death before he died. So I've given you that second column there that you can just take a look at. There, I've given you some examples, but the big idea is that what Mosaic authorship taken seriously does mean, it brings together the idea of sources and a single author who's inspired. He's writing for Israel as his real audience at various times in history. Now just a few quick comments on the world of the Old Testament. This is the world that we're moving into, starting with Genesis in the first 11 chapters, moving then to the Promised Land, or the land of Canaan, and Egypt along the way at a few places. But the big idea, the historical time frame of the Old Testament occurs between 3000 BC to 400 BC. And we have the Sumerian written records that begin way back even before that, 3100 BC. We have archaeological evidence for urban centers, towns that can be traced back as early as 7000 BC. For example, ancient Jericho. Biblical history begins in ancient Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, the location of the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, all along in here. Human history, as we'll see, begins here as well. But based on the genealogies, an approximate application of the genealogies of Genesis 5, 10 through 11, Abraham to Adam, we talk about the creation day 6 and Adam existing some 6 to 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. We have the Sumerian culture at its zenith, rising during the Ur-3 period, dating to 2100 to 1900 BC. This would be lining up during that time of Abraham. Sumerians' city-states are established, like Kish, Lagash, and ancient Ur, which is referred to in Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, Abraham's hometown. So these ancient Sumerian cities had highly developed law codes. They had texts that were focused on hymns, prayers, omens. Scientific literature was all part of this highly developed Mesopotamian culture, and this is exactly what we see Abraham leaving as he leaves Ur and he journeys up to Haran, and that's where his father Terah dies. So from Mesopotamian culture here, Abraham's home turf, Abraham's going to leave and gets his call and comes down to the Promised Land here. But parallel to this development is what's going on in Egypt at the same time. During Egypt's first intermediate period, which goes back to about 2350 to 2000 BC, right on the eve of Abraham, Egypt's pristine culture was in decline, and it was during the same time that Abraham visits Egypt, there in Genesis 12, verses 10 through 20. In the middle of the area here was circled as Syria, Palestine, or the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. Unfortunately, we know practically nothing from this area, from ancient texts or any evidence during this time period. The earliest that we have are the Ebla tablets, which shed some light on the period, and they date back to about 2500 to 2200 BC. We do know, however, that the early Bronze to Middle Bronze era, there was a large cultural transition that took place in this area, in the land of Canaan, or in the land of the Promised Land. Scholars argue that much of the cultural change that took place during this time was due to a large influx or migration of Amorites from the upper Euphrates, Tigris-Euphrates region. And this, interestingly, corresponds to the patriarchal migration to the land of Canaan, dating to about 2100 to 2000 BC. That's Abraham, Terah first, Abraham, his son, and then the household of Abraham. And just one last slide to kind of show you where biblical Hebrew or biblical history, people, places, things, and events kind of line up with some of the history, the Egyptian history of the pharaohs. So from Moses' birth, the Pharaoh who sought to kill the Hebrew sons in Exodus 1, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and we'll talk more about that when we get there, all the way up to Joshua's conquest of Canaan. So there's other things going on in the world that we know a lot about. During the same biblical history, there's parallel history in Egypt, as well as parallel history in Mesopotamia. So that's about all I want to say on this discussion covering the topics that we did. So I hope it's been helpful, and we'll see you next week, either online or back in class.